Hi, this is Jesper from Velocitypeak, and in today's X Particles tutorial, we're going to make this. Let me play from the beginning. So I don't even really know what to call it, but we have these explosions and other things going on. So that's what we'll build today. Now, if you want to follow along, all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so let's start. Now, I have a few things already set up. I have a timeline of 340 frames. I have a few materials set up. And then I have a sphere. And if I highlight the sphere, let's go to the object tab first. It's 60 centimeters. The radius is 60 centimeters. I have 48 segments, and I set the type to be an icosahedron. So we have some more even topology. Now, I also have just a little bit of rotation on it. So over the course of 340 frames, it's just going to rotate ever so slightly. So pretty low numbers there. Now, I've also added this into a cloth surface. And just so we can get some thickness. And if we look at the values, we don't have any subdivisions, but we have a thickness of 5. I also added a display tag to it. And if I click on use, then we can see through it because we're going to add the emitters on the inside here. So that's why. Now, I don't want to actually see this while we set up the X particle system here. So I am going to hide this by Alt or Option on the traffic lights. I can just hide it. So now the first thing I'm going to do is to bring in an X particles system. And let's go to the emitter. And under the object tab, I'm going to keep it as an ellipse, but I will make this a really small ellipse. So the H and V radius are both going to be 1. So it's a tiny little ellipse. And I'm going to click this ring only. So now it's just emitting from the ring. Now it's so small, we can probably not even see a difference, perhaps a little bit. But we're also going to do the cone angle. I'm going to bring the cone angle to 90. So now that it shoots out, it's going to shoot out in this direction. We can see it a little better from this angle, perhaps. It's just in one direction. And then let's stop this and let's go to the emission tab. And I don't want this to be an emission mode of rate. I'm going to set this to pulse. And let's scroll up there. So pulse is going to enable us to shoot out particles at a certain kind of interval. And right now, the length is 1 frame each every 30 frames. So if I play this back now, it's going to shoot out every 30 frames for 1 frame duration. Now I'm going to change the duration to 2 frames, but I'm going to up the intervals to 45. So it's going to look like this. And I also don't want them to have a full lifespan. So let's change that. So instead of a full lifespan, I am going to set a lifespan of 74. Now remember this number because we're going to use that a little bit later on. And let's switch the birth rate from 1,000 to 100 each time. So now we have this. And let's reduce the speed. So let's do 35 for the speed. Let's bring in a bit of variation, say 10. So something like this. So it's a lot slower now. Now, I'm going to bring down the radius to 1. We won't see a change because the display mode is set to dots. But this is important when we go for rendering later on. Now, I'm going to go to display. And I'm going to keep it as dots. But the color mode, I'm going to set this to gradient random. And then let's pull this one a little to the side so we can see the entire gradient. So I'm going to just create 2 color stops. This one I'm going to make like an orange, yellowish orange, something like so. And then let's make this one and like a bluish. Something like that. So now when we play, we get this. So next step, let's add trails to this. So let's go to generators, and we want a XP trail. And we need to specify the emitter. So let's bring down the emitter. And let's call this emitter XP emitter main, because we're going to have another one a little bit later on. So in the trails, if we play it now, we're going to get trails. And it looks a little strange because they die. So the trails disappear when the particles die. So what I would like to have is for the trails to shrink in a more kind of natural way before they just die. And we can do that if we use an XP trail modifier. So if we go to control modifiers, XP trails modifier, and the operation is set to shrink. So it's going to start shrinking them right away. If we play back now, it's going to start shrinking them right away. So we don't even see any trails. But what I would like to happen is so that they start shrinking halfway throughout their life. And so if I go to the emitter and I go to the questions tab, and I'm going to add a question. Okay, scroll up here. Now the question type by default is particle data, and the data type is age, and that's actually perfect. And do you remember the number we used, which was 74? Well, I'm going to go half that. So I want them to start shrinking after half their life. So 74 divided by 2, quick math, 37. So now we also need to say, okay, so that's the question. After 37 frames, what are we going to do? Are we going to add an action, which is possible, or we can also activate or deactivate modifiers. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to bring in the trails modifier. So now this will be activated after 37 frames. So if we play it back now, this is what we get. So this is a lot more interesting. Good. Okay, so the next step is to add this to a network. So modifiers, and then we want to go to generate. In fact, it's not generators, it's under motion, and then network. And just play back now. We're going to get this unwanted result, just this big mess. I'm going to show you two ways how we can fix this. Now, the first way is to go back to the main emitter. And at the beginning, we set the object to have a cone angle of 90 degrees. So if I set it back to its default of 0, the network's actually going to work as expected. But I want to show you another way. So if I set this back to 90 degrees, go back to the network. In the network, we have something called constraint axis. And this is an add-on, maybe Xparticles 4. I don't remember when it came out. But this enables the network to work with other modifiers, such as turbulence or even explosion. So now if I bring this up to 100, it's now working again. Now, of course, we could have just set the ring angle back to 0 and it would have worked, but I just wanted to show you that you can use this really powerful constraint axis option. Okay, so let's change a few of these things. This is going to change in 10 frames. I'm going to keep that. I'm going to set it to variation of 2. And then I am going to take down pitch threshold, heading threshold, change angle pitch. So now we're left with this. And this could be pretty interesting for certain results. I just want to have a little bit more going on. So I'm going to change the angle here, the heading, to 45. So now we get this kind of result. Of course, you can play around with this for a really long time and get very different looks. But this is going to work for what I want to do. Let's stop this. So the next step here is we need this to collide with the sphere that we have. So to do that, let's go to the sphere. And I'm going to right-click, Xparticles tags, and I want an XP collider. Now, in the option for this collider tag, want to make sure that the normals are set to inside. And just going to bring up bounce to 100, friction to 0, and scatter to 100. So then we get this. So this is really close to what's going to be the final for this. But I want to make a few more changes. I want to have them interact with the collision deformer a little different. So I'm going to go to dynamics and do XP flow field to zoom out a little bit. Now this flow field is too big, so let's make it a little smaller so we don't take out all that computational power. And let's bring it down there, something like that. Something like that. I think that's good. And let's frame this in the center. Oops, undo. Good. So in the flow field, under the display tab, let's hide the vectors. We don't need to see them. And if you just play now, we're not gonna see that much of a difference. But if I go back to the general tab and change the flow from default to surface normal, and then that essentially enables us to use an object as an attractor. But we need to bring in object here. So let's bring in the sphere, and let's see what we get. You don't really see that much of a difference, but let's do a few things here. First of all, if I bring this up to 100%, you're going to see a little bit of difference. And if I take off the fall off, so there's no fall off whatsoever, we get a very kind of different look. So now it's just shooting off in one direction. And I want to add one more thing to the emitter to illustrate this effect. So I'm going to go to the XP emitter main, and I'm going to right click, animation tags, and I'm going to do a vibrate tag. And in the vibrate, I'm just going to shift the position, so enable position, and let's do a little bit more extreme to begin with. 50, 50, 50. I'm going to set that to 0.3. So now it's going to shoot out in different locations. And then it's going to go to whatever nearest position on that sphere, the normal. It's going to go towards the normal of that sphere. That's not exactly what I want. So I'm going to bring this down to a much more modest amount, so say 10. Can leave the frequency at 0.3. And back in the flow field, I'm going to change the cell size down to something like 24. And this is essentially the resolution. And then I'm going to bring back the fall off, but I'm going to bring it a little higher. If you have it much higher, you're going to have more of an effect. This is going to be more subtle. And then I'm going to bring down the strength of this to say 40. And I may obviously play around with this. There is no magic number. So I think something like that is going to do it for us. So I'm going to be happy with that. I could play around with this all day, but I'm going to be happy with that. So let's hide this from view so we can hide it. We don't need to see it. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is that we want to have the explosions happen. So how can we do that? Well, we can use another modifier. And if we go to generate modifiers, we can use something called XP spawn. And the XP spawn is going to spawn new particles from already existing particles. And we need to add a spawning emitter for that. So we can click this button, add spawning emitter. And that creates an emitter for us. I'm going to call this XP emitter spawn. And if we just hit play now, we're going to get spawning right away. Now, that's obviously not what I want. I just want this to happen when it collides with a sphere. So how can we do that? Well, we can use another question. Let's go back to our XP emitter main and back to the questions tab. And let's add a question. Go up. So what you can check for when you have a collision tag on an object, you can check for collision. When a collision has happened, do something. Now the question type is going to be under particle flags. And I got to scroll back up again. So the default here, particle collided with an object, is what we want. So then when they've collided, what's going to happen? Well, we can do the same thing that we did before. We can activate a modifier. So we can bring the XP spawn and activate that when this condition is true, when they have collided. So let's see what we get now. And they explode, and now we get the spawning. Now, it's spawning too much. I don't want this many particles. So I'm going to add something to this question. I'm going to go back to the question particle collided, and we can add a sub questions. So it's test sub questions mode, and we can also do or, but I want and. So when they have collided and something more is true, do something. So let's create the sub question. And the question type is going to be under other, and we are looking for random probability. So we can essentially set a number for how probable the collisions are going to be. So at 100%, it's going to be exactly the same thing. It's 100%. The probability is 100%. To bring it down to 0, we're not going to get any collisions at all. Now, depending on, because we have so many particles here, we need to go in the lower registry of this, because even if I bring it up to, say, 30, we're going to get a lot of explosions right away. So I think perhaps if you go something low like 0.3 or 0.1, then you're not going to have that many. But that's going to be a little too little. So let's set this to 2. I think, oh, not 23, 2. And let's see what we get. So I think that is a reasonable amount. So let's set up the actual emitter, the spawning emitter, to behave a little differently. So let's go to XP emitter spawn, and under emission, you can see that the emission mode is set to controlled only. It's being controlled by the XP spawn. Now, I don't want them to have a full lifespan. I'm going to set the lifespan to 50 and perhaps variation of 20. And then I am going to set a speed of 25. And I'm going to set the radius to 1. And let's see what we get. So now it's beginning to become a little bit more manageable. Now I also want to have these scaled down over time. We can't see the scaling because the display mode is set to dots. But if I go to display and switch this to circle, circle is going to show us the actual size of the particles. So now I want to have them scale down over time, and we can do that with a scaling modifier. So if I go to modifiers, and then I go to control modifiers, we have an XP scale. Now, before I do that, I want to make 2 things here. If I go to the XP emitter main, and I look under modifiers, the normal mode is set to exclude. So by default, all modifiers that you add to a system is affecting this emitter. Now, the other one, if we go to exclude, we can see that the XP spawn was actually put in by default under the exclude. If it's not included there, or if it's not excluded, then we're going to get spawned particles from other spawned particles, and you just get too many particles, and your computer might crash pretty quickly. So this is just a precaution that's built into the system. But I want to switch this to include. And then I want to make sure that this XP spawn is not included in this. I'm going to delete that. So now only modifiers that I manually drag into this field are going to be included. So I want to make sure that the XP scale is included. And I'm going to rename this one XP scale for unspawned, just so I know. And then I'm going to go to the XP emitter spawned, and then I'm going to drag it in. But I also need to go into the main emitter, and I want to say I don't want to have XP scaled included. So I'm going to drag that in. And I know this is getting a little confusing. You just really have to be on top of this. So let's go to the XP scale spawn. What do we want to do? We want to make them smaller. So the operation by default is change value over time absolute. And we can do that. We can keep that. But I don't want them to get bigger. I want them to get smaller. So I'm going to do minus 0.01. And if we play back now, see that over time they get smaller. And that's exactly what I want. Good. So now let's go back to the XP emitter spawn. I'm going to set the display back to dots, so it's quicker in the viewport. And let's also affect the movement a little bit, so they have just a little bit more interesting movement. So I'm going to go to the modifiers and add good old turbulence. And again, I want to make sure I go into the main emitter to the modifiers. And I want to drag in the turbulence, and let's rename this one XP turbulence spawned. Oops. Spawned like so. And then bring this in here. Exclude that, but include it with our spawning emitter. And let's make some changes here. Let's play this back and make some changes while it's playing. I'm going to switch the noise type to curl, and it's going to go kind of crazy here. If I go up here, I'm going to set this to a really small scale, 5, and do 66.3. Now, obviously, I've played with these a lot, so I have these values, but usually it comes after me playing around for quite some time. Now, I'm going to bring up the octaves. So to 6.6, so it's a more complex noise. And I'm just going to bring down the strength somewhat to 3, so it's fairly weak. But I'm also going to go down to the curl settings themselves. We have blend and we have add. So blending is you blend between the velocity from the curl and the original particles. So I'm going to bring this down so we get more of the original particle speed back. There's something like 5 or 6. And add is how much curl do you add to the particles. Right now we have 20%. If you bring this to 100, it goes really crazy. So I'm going to keep this pretty low, like around 5 or 4 or so. Usually you have to bring these down fairly low or the curl tends to take over. So I think I'm going to be happy. I'm going to be happy with that. And now that is that's the main setup for it. Let me stop this. So after this, it's actually time to render. And I'm going to render with cycles 4D. But in order to be able to render, we need to add some tags. So let's go first to XP emitter spawn, right click and say cycles 4D tags and do an instance. And in the instance here, I am going to bring down the sphere segments. We don't need 24 segments for something that's going to be so tiny we can't even see it. So I'm going to go down to 8. And I'm going to go size multiplier of 5. So these are going to be really, really small. And then I'm going to control or command drag that over to the other emitter. I can leave the sphere segments at 8, but I'm going to bring this up in size a lot. So they're much bigger, so 50. And then let's also add a tag to the trails and cycles 4D tags. And let's get a curve tag. And the start and end, I'm going to make the same, but I'm going to make it fairly thin. So 0.001. And just bring in a little bit of variation. Why not? Something like that. If I hold down the control key, I just add middle point. Maybe something like that. I think that's going to be pretty good. So good. So now we are ready to go for render, except one thing, of course, that I forgot. If we go to XP spawn, we have the amount of spawning particles. Right now it's set to 300 per second. And that's not nearly enough for what we need. First of all, I'm going to change this from per second. So we're going to do per frame. So now it's 300 per frame. You're going to see a lot more particles now. But that isn't actually enough. I'm going to set the spawn number to 30,000. 1,000 with a variation of 10. So that's a lot of particles. But I also want to make sure that they only spawn once. So if I check this, the source particle can only spawn once. If we don't check this, we're going to get a lot more particles. So now you're going to be able to see the flow of the particles a lot better. Good. So we're all set up to go for render. And I'm going to switch to layout, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I switched the view. I have the Cycles 4D real-time preview in the middle. And the node editor is on the left side, and I have the standard perspective view on the top right. And then we have the objects manager and the attributes manager down here, and then the materials. Now, let me go to the bottom here. We have a few more scene elements. If I unhide those. Oops, that's difficult. Okay, so what I have is I have a camera set up. And let me twirl that down so we can see. I have a camera, which is a 15 millimeter camera. And just a little bit of depth of field. Not a lot, just a little bit. 0.01. And the depth of field is focused right in the middle of that sphere. So if I look through that camera, we're going to see this. And I also added these rings here just for some framing. We're not going to use any lights in the scene. All the lights are coming from emission materials. So if I play now, we're not going to see anything because we don't have any materials added yet. So let's add materials. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you one by one the materials, and then we'll build the glass together. So the first material I want to do is just the main material, which is this guy here, Emission Network. So if I bring that on, we can see something. Let me hide our explosion for now. So you can see that it's taking on the colors from the one that we set up at the beginning under the display. We set up grading color from a random. So we have, let me pull this over. So we have this blue and this orange, and randomly is pulling between them. So if I open this up in the node editor, having some display issues. This is a really simple setup. So we have an emission node, 15 for the emission strength, and then we're using a particle info and the color from the particle. So if we right click and say input, then we have a particle info node with all this data. And this is one of the main benefits of using Cycles 4D with X particles. We get access to all this data. So I'm just using the color here. So it's pulling randomly between them. Now the next one, let's look at the XP trail. And that's this guy right here. So if I put that on top, you can see that we have this kind of bluish material. And let me open that in the node editor. Having some trouble refreshing here. If I stop that and do it again, usually it's quicker. Click away. Try again. Here you go. Okay. So this materials is set up in a fairly similar way in that we have an emission. Just the strength is just 1 for this emission. And then we have this blue, lighter blue, and a slightly darker blue in a color ramp. But it's getting the color from this hair info. If we can get that from if you right click input, and we have hair info. And I'm using a random color. So in this node, we can use the random option, and then it's going to pull randomly, and I am mapping that to these blue colors. So if you wanted to have like a rainbow effect, for example, you can go and you can do a converter, color ramp, get the random mode, and then let's just get something with more colors, something like this perhaps. And we got to start the real time. And you can see we get the color from here. So we could change to a different preset, say something like this. then it will pull in randomly from whatever we have here. But in this case, we're just using a fairly modest ramp. If you want to color them from the start to the end, you want to use the intercept option. Then you can color them differently from the time they're born and to the time that they die. But we are just going to use this one. And then let's also, next one, let's go for our explosion material. So let's bring in this one, mission for the spawned. And let's enable that. And there you go. And let's stop this so we don't get the refresh issue. And let me bring this into the node editor. And then let's play again. So the way this is set up is, again, emission, this time strength of 5. And we have a ramp going into the emission, defining the colors. But the colors we are getting from the object info and its position. So if I right click and say input, then we have object info. And if I solo position, you can see that we're going to get colors here. Let it update. So we're getting the position data of the particles and we're using them to color. And then we remap the colors with this color ramp here. So that's how we get the colors. So it's a pretty interesting way of coloring the particles. So you can see what I did. So that's set up for that. Now, on top of this, let's add the glass material. So let's build that from scratch. Create, cycles 4D, and then let's do surface, glass. And let's go down to our sphere. We need to enable this so we can see it. And then let's put this glass material onto the sphere and play. So already, just by adding this to a glass material, it starts to look a lot more interesting. Now, I do want to point out that if I go to my render settings under cycles 4D, I have max ray bounces set up to 5. This is by default 1, but that's not enough when you deal with transparency and refraction and glass and stuff. So you have to test, but I have 5, so a lot more bounces. Okay, so let me stop this one and then get the glass into the node editor. And let's make a few changes here. First of all, the glass, I just want to have a little bit of roughness, so 0.02. And then I'm going to bring this IOR up to 3. We're just going to change this a lot. And I'm also going to give this just a bit of a tint. So I'm going to leave the hue, that's an orange, but bring this up to around like 10-ish. Something like that. So now we have some colored glass. But I also want to use more color. So I'm going to take this original and I'm going to control that to make a copy. I'm going to keep roughness and IR exactly the same, but I'm going to pipe in some colors into this new one. So let's look at this one first. Or by itself, I should say. And I'm going to get a texture and a noise texture. And I'm going to click on color to solo that. And I'm going to bring down the scale to just 2. And then I am going to put that into a ramp. So converter, color ramp, get the color. And let's pipe the color into the color for that glass material. And then I'm going to solo this color ramp. And I can really put whatever colors I want here. I'm going to start with, say, an orange, yellow, orange. This one. Something like that. And then let's control drag. I'm going to make it like a blue, perhaps. And let's get another orange. Let's shift the hue a little bit. Get a little different. Do one more orange. A bit more towards orange. And then let's do another blue. A bit more towards green. And let's pull it over so we can actually see this. Yeah, something like that. Maybe this is too saturated. And let's switch this up to a more of a yellow. I mean, something like that. I don't have a particular result in mind. I think that's good. So let's see what we get now. So now we get a lot more colors. But I don't want to have this as intense. I want to blend between these. So let's get a shader, a mix shader. And I am going to put the original glass at the bottom and then the color glass on the top, shader 1. So now we have a blend between them. But now I want to have the colors, I want to have the colors being affected depending on the angle that we view this. So we want to use a Fresnel node, or we can use a layer weight. So let's go input, and we can do Fresnel, but we can do layer weight. We have a Fresnel option there as well. And really interesting redrawing issues I get here, but I will just deal with that. Let's get a converter and then a color ramp. And I'm going to use the facing option. And let's highlight the color ramp, just solo that so we can see what it's going to do. Okay, so it's going to blend, depending on what is white and black, it's going to blend between the colors. I am going to invert these. So if I right click under the bar here, I can say invert gradient. And let's pull this black in a little bit. And then I'm going to unsolo that, and I'm going to use this as the factor in the mix shader. So now we are blending between those two materials. And let's get some extra space here. And perhaps try a different frame. Let's go back. Let's play this until we have some more explosions. So we have a lot there. So let's try this frame and see what we get. And there you go. And yeah, that's the final result. Now, if you're gonna animate this, or even if you're just gonna render out a still, I really recommend to go back into your X particle system and then go to other objects and get a cache and cache this. Cache this, I almost always do to external files and cache this. It's gonna give much more predictable results. Always recommended, especially for an animation, but even for a still. I'm not going to do that because I'm just showing you how to set this up. But so I'm going to get some extra space here, and let me go for something like 24. Render this out so we can see the final result. And I'm going to stop this, and I'll be back when this has finished rendering. Okay, so this one has finished rendering, and this is the final result. And that brings this tutorial to an end. Now, I'm sure you could take this in a lot of different directions. So if you come up with something cool, send me a link. I'd like to see it. And let me know if you have any questions for this or anything else. Just let me know in the comments. Now, all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. And thank you for sticking around. I'll see you next time.